Num num. Birdie num num.
When I have understanding of computers, I shall be the supreme being. God isn't interested in technology. He knows nothing of the potential of the microchip or the silicon revolution. Look how he spends his time. 43 species of parrots. Nipples for men.
Don't do that, Jesus Christ! You're gonna get me killed!
Out of here!
Oh, Billy. Ah!
I have nipples, Greg. Could you milk me?
Heresy shouldn't be this much fun, but it is. It just is. Especially when you join Aeon Byte, especially on a Saturday night. Welcome, everybody. Come on, baby. Take a chance on us. Very excited about this show and very excited to see you. My name is Miguel Connor, and I am your Pompatus of Gnosis. And tonight we've got a very exciting show and a very important figure whose time has arrived that we shed light into the light of the pleroma, into his truth, and a truth that is more important than ever to restore the soul of to restore the soul of this world and the world's soul too. And that is Jim Morrison. So I'm very excited that we are joined by Paul Wyld to discuss a book that you certainly need to have with you right now. And that is Jim Morrison, Secret Teacher of the Occult, A Journey to the Other Side. Paul, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Pleasure is all ours. And again, great book. And with us too, we've got the Moondog Vance. Vance, are you going to light our fire?
Oh, I don't know. I was just came out of the Soul Kitchen.
Baby
So I got
roll, baby roll.
all the burners are on. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'm glad you're here too, and I'm glad to see already people storming into the chat room. Of course, this is a topic of much interest. Jim Morrison, of course, influenced so many people for so many generations, including myself. I think first time I heard him, I was in the back seat of my dad's car. We were visiting the United States from Mexico, and on the radio came Riders on the Storm. My dad hated rock and roll, but he liked jazz. Somehow he liked this song because he was jamming to, and I was like terrified as a kid because of the lyrics. And I think that was the first time in my life at 5-year-old I knew what existentialism was, if you know what I mean. But of course, later on, his music really saved my ass and fulfilled so many dreams in my life. But we will certainly unpack that and much more. As always, if you have any questions for Paul or comments for Vance and I, please super chat them so we can get to them. Always great if you can support Aeon Byte, subscribe, share, tell all your friends, or throw some tips out our way. So, Paul, let's talk about you and how you came into this journey. As you write in your book, you had a dark night of the soul, I think around 2016. Do you want to start there, or do you want to start, what was your entrance to the doors?
Sure. Yeah, in 2016, I moved back to Los Angeles from Boston. And just in a personal place in my life, you just kind of lost yourself and you want to get back to who you are, At the same time, that was a time in my life where this is where I'm going to take a deep dive into the occult. I mean, I've always been attracted to writers and poets and artists that I realize now more than ever were expressing things that were a part of the Western esoteric tradition. One of the books I discovered in 2016 and really got to reading in 2017 was The Secret Teachers of the Western World by Gary Lachman. This book changed my life. I really did not know exactly what the Western esoteric tradition was. And now I'm convinced that if you want to understand history, you have to be familiar with the Western esoteric tradition. It's a several thousand, year old, spiritual story, and many great figures in history are a part of this. It's a big part of our story. So the more I kept reading this book, the more Jim Morrison came came to my mind until at the end of the book, I had accumulated so many notes in the margins about Jim Morrison. I thought, wow, this is really compelling. I started to say to myself, I think this is the right lens in which to view his life. I think this is the reason why we feel that so many of us feel that he's so much more than just a rock star. What you're getting is a secret teacher, much like all these great figures in the past, in the Western esoteric tradition. These people have a very strong connection with that other reality, that unseen reality. And these people have an overpowering desire to express this, as they grow older, because their connection to that world is just so strong. Jim Morrison, his desire to know is just so great that there's no turning away from that calling. And everything about all the secret teachers that I read in Gary Lackman's book are all there in Jim Morrison. It's actually really breathtaking.
Mm-hmm.
And then I watched Lawrence of Arabia again at a film festival, and I realized that this film also influenced Jim Morrison a great deal. That was my suspicion, and I was able to befriend someone that went to school with him at UCLA. He doesn't want to be named; he just wants to be left out of it. But he confirmed that Jim Morrison did see that movie and that he did love it.
Mm.
And this is a very esoteric film also about a person that just, T. Lawrence is the first rock star. He goes out into the desert to become somebody else amid the Bedouin tribes. And, he has like a whole new different outfit, and he's photographed by that American journalist. And, it just kind of gave Jim Morrison that, that further inspiration that, you can go off and you can do something different to fulfill his secret teacher mission. It's an amazing story. And it began with reading Secret Teachers of the Western World.
Yeah, Gary's book is excellent. And I interviewed him back there, 2016, 2017. And all of Gary's work is just outstanding. I believe that's the book, Paul, where he talks about the poet Petrarch. It's the first time in history that somebody actually went to nature to enjoy it. Before that, humans worshipped in nature and all that, but we pretty much avoided it and all that. And Petrarch was the first person to say, I'm going to go look at the view. It was a complete shift in consciousness where suddenly we weren't just fighting or terrified of nature or worshiping nature. We were just like, this is nice. So, I mean, Gary's books always have, as 20, 30 just gems, just insights and gems. And I agree with you that you make a very good case that Morrison is part of this amazing stream that is really a foundation of human consciousness, the health of humanity, the energy for us to innovate and think outside the box and understand ourselves. But before we get into that, you said you were trying to find yourself again, because obviously that's the journey, right? Sometimes we lose ourselves. We find out. How did you lose yourself, or what were you trying to get back to in your journey of Lachman and Morrison and all that?
I was in a relationship in Boston. We wanted to start a band and all that, but that didn't work out because this person had other things that were going on. I was just at a place where I need to change cities, and I need to go inward. And I'd never really done that. We all reach points in our lives, especially as we approach the middle parts of our lives. We have to go inward, and I think I did what many of us do. We go back to the things that we love to find our child again. And for me, that was reading books. That was just diving into history and literature and everything that used to make me really tick. And that was my original hook for Jim Morrison. I read No One Here Gets Out Alive in 1983. Mm-hmm. And I thought, hey, this guy loves books too. This guy's an intellectual. Jim Morrison made all that really cool. Suddenly I had, as I say in the first paragraph of my book, I feel like I had a mentor, a guide. So I started, with Secret Teachers, I started to feel myself just come alive again. I think it did it when I read about Hypatia, the Hellenistic mathematician, and what happened to this lady in her lifetime. And I found the movie about her called Agora. Yeah, Rachel Weisz plays her. And the terrible end that she met in the film, that's the only film that made me cry. I was upset for days. That's when I knew I was like, you can learn a lot about yourself by what gets you going, like, what hits big emotions in you. And that's when I knew that I was feeling vital again. Let's put it that way. And it's interesting story is that I'd read a book that Gary wrote when he called himself Gary Valentine about leaving New Jersey to go to New York and meeting Chris Stein and Blondie and all that. And he talked about living in a department store, at an abandoned department store with glass everywhere with his guitar. And like that story stuck with me. And it was really cool to find out that Gary Lackman is this Gary Valentine. Are you this guy? Gary's he's very generous. I reached out to him on Facebook to let him know how much I love this book. He was very generous. He was very kind. He was very patient with me. And when I told him I wanted to write this, and I was very fortunate. I got in contact with all the writers that did their books I really loved, and they were all really supportive and generous. I just felt this invisible hand, this invisible force with this.
Right.
I don't want to say like the book wrote itself. I had to work pretty hard, but it was almost as if the spirit's like, if you work hard, we're going to lay the breadcrumbs out there for you. This was I could write a book about writing this book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And the great movie. I liked Hypatia. Yeah, speaking of going back to Jim Morrison, I think one of my moments was Apocalypse Now, the beginning, right? Remember, with Martin Sheen playing the end, and there's the fire, and Martin Sheen is struggling with alcoholism and PTSD. It was one of the greatest scenes I've ever seen in movie theater, and it just hits the shadow side of our country, the shadow side of the American dream. It was a very powerful scene to me, and
that's right. He was having a nervous breakdown right there on the camera.
Right. Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, because there's the whole movie, the documentary about the Heart of Darkness, of course. And I had read the Heart of Darkness before watching the end. So, I mean, before watching Apocalypse Now, so it was double powerful. But that just tells you how well Jim Morrison's magic just fits, defines an age and all that. And if somebody,
Jim Morrison was in film school when Francis Ford Coppola was there.
Really? Wow.
Yes, Jim Morrison was at UCLA. A lot of his classmates and his teachers were just amazing artists in the realm of film and experimental film too.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Yeah, he was definitely had his hands in a lot of things. And when individuals ask you about the Western esoteric tradition, again, they're not familiar with Gary Lachman, they're more into Jim Morrison. What do you tell them? Because a lot of people ask, what is this guy talking? People know occultism and mysticism, but what is the Western esoteric tradition?
So the Western esoteric tradition, as I understand and have learned from Gary Lachman, and then later from a book that Jim Morrison found in high school called The History of Magic and the Occult, written by Kurt Seligman.
Right.
And also from Colin Wilson's 1971 book, The Occult. All three of these books are excellent if you want to learn about the Western esoteric tradition. It's, in a nutshell, a really exciting and very thrilling story of people who are part of something that they've created over time called the rejected knowledge, what the poet Robert Graves also calls the lunar knowledge. And these are people who are in touch, with another reality, the unseen world. I kind of, it's a little difficult to explain to people who are not really too spiritual and not right. Waking up, so to speak. And a good way to understand this is there's a scene, if you've seen the movie The Thin Red Line. Mm-hmm. In the beginning of the movie, there's a scene with Sean Penn and I forget the other actor, but he plays a character called Wit. Jim Caviezel, did I pronounce his name?
Yeah.
And he tells Sean Penn that that there's another world that he's seen, that sometimes he feels like it's just his imagination. And what he's saying is actually true. Like, you need your imagination in order to make that other unseen, other reality vivid for yourself, because it is there. And that's the function of the imagination. I mean, Gary has another book about this as well.
Right.
So that is a good way to explain this to people. Is that it's a history of people that have their activation, their imaginations have been activated, have been come alive by contact with an unseen world, with the unseen reality. And these are people who they get into trouble for expressing this. Sometimes, it's especially during like the Inquisition, during ancient Roman times. In the 1960s, they went after Jim Morrison. He didn't expose himself in Miami. What happened is that they found something to nail him with, because the idea was to get him convicted and send him. My strong belief is that the idea was to get him convicted and then have him sent to Rayford prison where he can be easily killed. I really believe that was the goal, because when you look at his story through the lens of the Western esoteric tradition and what all past secret teachers have gone through, they're very similar to Jim Morrison's story, where in the end, they're executed, they're jailed, they're tortured, they're silenced. And in Jim Morrison's day, J. Edgar Hoover and Nixon and all of them, they were not keen on having the son of one of America's most outstanding military officers turn America's baby boomers onto cosmic consciousness and divine reality and their divine self. Because when you do that, you lose power over people. You lose power over their minds. You become an autonomous person. And Jim Morrison was all about freedom. All about freedom. And just like Giordano Bruno, the Italian mathematician who took a chance on going back to Italy when they thought they forgot about him, he went back to Italy in the early 1590s, and he had a falling out with his patron, and they arrested him, and the Inquisition got him, and they jailed him for many years, and they executed him in 1600.
Right.
Jim Morrison in Paris, he's convicted. See, I really had to walk with this person, He goes to Paris in March 1971 to find himself again, start writing poetry again. But hanging over his head is this conviction, because he's still on bond with his appeal. His lawyers are telling him there's a great chance that he's going to get off on appeal. But you've already been convicted of something that you did not do. So it's, I'm certain, I would just bet my life that Jim Morrison is in Paris, and he's actually asking people, like, I want some kind of assurance that if I'm convicted, if I lose on the appeal, I'm not going to end up doing 6 months of hard labor in Rayford prison in Florida. Of course, nobody can guarantee him that. So you're Jim Morrison, and you just don't know what's going to happen to you. When you go back to America, do you take a chance on that? France doesn't have an extradition treaty with the United States. That's why Roman Polanski stays there, right? So Jim Morrison could have just stayed there. John Densmore said it. It was possible that he probably just disappeared because of this.
Right.
So this is the pattern with secret teachers, in the Western esoteric tradition. When I try to explain this to people, then the absolute to my astonishment, my great surprise, is that in Jim Morrison we have one of these people that comes along every 150 years in the form of a rock star. I mean, if you want to learn about this, all you have to do is go online and YouTube and all these things and learn all about Jim Morrison's life, and you're going to learn about a secret teacher, a person who they overcome their fear of what society is going to think about them and expressing what is going on with them, and then they make their own path. And in Jim Morrison's case, as in all the cases of these other secret teachers, it's like a double-edged sword. There's not like a double-edged sword, but the conditions out there in society there's just enough going on in the 60s where everybody's receptive to a person like Jim Morrison. That's the time of the world's first popular occult awakening, right? But there's still also just enough in the culture that's very conservative that doesn't want this to happen either, that went after him.
Very true.
So when the Western esoteric tradition flowed through Jim Morrison like a raging river. And there's so many different tributaries off that river that are intellectually and spiritually and artistically very rich, really magnificent, with very long, traditions behind them. And the 60s seem to embody a lot of the Renaissance epics in the Western esoteric tradition. And Jim Morrison seems to embody a lot of what those past secret teachers had as well. It's almost like things just sort of like they really coalesced at that time. It wasn't just the birth of rock and roll that Jim Morrison said that he was his coming of age was coincidental with. He was also coincidental with the world's first occult awakening, and that this to me is the core of Jim Morrison's story. With And with that Doors film by Oliver Stone, I like his other movies. This movie has a lot of problems because there's a lot of things in his film that are not correct.
Correct.
I became friends with Bill Cosgrave, who lived with Jim Morrison for a couple of years here in Los Angeles at UCLA during his time at UCLA and performing the Doors. He was also friends with Jim Morrison's girlfriend, Mary Werbelow. When Mary saw the film, she said that's only 15 to 20% of Jim. The rest of him is just not there.
Right.
So hopefully there'll be a reprise of his life, out there in the future. Jim Morrison hated Hollywood. He called it syrup for the masses. So it's kind of sad that there's a Hollywood movie that's misrepresenting his life this way. Ray Manzarek hated his film. He hated it so much that he got into Oliver Stone's face about it on set, and Oliver Stone threw him off the set, banned him from the set, and then this caused Ray Manzarek to go off and to make another documentary about Jim Morrison.
Wow, that's incredible. Yeah, I mean, what was I going to say? Just unpacking a little bit of what or piggybacking of what you're saying. I remember when the issue in Miami and all that, and he was an interview, and he's like, "Look, I'm a rich rock star. I can throw money at this thing, and I've thrown a lot of money, which is insane. It's supposed to be a just society, but." He felt bad because he's like, there's all these black people who don't have my money and they're getting thrown in jail for 20, 30 years. So he had a sense of empathy and justice in the early 70s when he was already, rich and famous and godlike with the public. So, and it's interesting about the film, the Oliver Stone film, as I always thought Val Kilmer was sort of miscast to begin with. I always thought they should have put what's his name, Jason Patrick from The Lost Boys. He looked more like Jim Morrison. Of course, ironic. The Lost Boys has that song by Echo and the Bunnymen, the cover "When You're Strange," and they do a great job. It's one of the few times when somebody did a Doors cover that was good, that didn't suck, because it's hard to replicate. Eddie Vedder and all these singers. Of course, a whole generation replicates Jim Morrison, but the Doors sound and that essence. Scott Weiland, of course, of Stone Temple Pilots. He never was trying to copy Eddie Vedder. He was, years before he was trying to copy Jim Morrison. So it's just throwing some interesting stuff there too. But why don't we unpack a little bit about the influences of Jim so we can try to understand? I mean, it seems when he was a kid, he saw a horrible accident with some natives, and that really changed his psyche, didn't it, Paul? I mean, that was a huge pivotal time in his life.
He considered that moment in his life to be the most significant moment in his life. So that the experience when he was 3 years old, his family was on a trip in northern New Mexico, a road trip, and they came across this is huge, Doors mythology, right? They came across an accident of dying Native American workers, and Jim Morrison told his friends on the set while they were making his film Highway and American Pastoral that he felt that the souls of one or two of those dying Native workers, had leaped into his and remained there for his entire life. It does fit a pattern with shamans when they're young, that there's a spiritual transference, there's a spiritual indwelling that takes place that stays with them. I have read this in Mircea Eliad's Shamanism, Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy.
Yeah.
This book was translated to English in 1964, and I'm sure Jim Morrison read it. I'm sure there was a copy available at UCLA where Carlos Castaneda was teaching, et cetera, and so forth.
Right.
So that there's much more to this, though. There's much, much more to that story, is what surrounds it. That's how I begin the book. Los Alamos National Laboratory, the home of the Manhattan Project, where the atom bomb was created, that used to be called the Los Alamos Ranch School for Boys. And that's where William S. Burroughs, the beat writer, went to school as a kid.
Right.
And he felt that he liked the idea, kind of fun, like a novel, kind of fun, that's the place where Oppenheimer came later on and turned it into Los Alamos. Because Oppenheimer was also a student there when he was a kid. And General Groves put Oppenheimer in charge of the Manhattan Project and said, find a place where we can do this. And you remember northern New Mexico there when he was a boy. So the Army, or the American military at the time, they went to that place and they bought the school. And in April 1943, that's when Oppenheimer convened as scientists to begin the Manhattan Project. Also in April 1943, that is when Albert Hoffman accidentally doused his hand with the LSD that he had discovered 5 years earlier and kept on the shelf.
Mm-hmm.
And he had a very interesting, bike ride home. And that's how I start the book, because in a spiritual sense, we're developing this weapon that we can destroy ourselves. And it's almost like, LSD is something given to us that can accelerate, our spiritual look at the world. There's so many people that have had, life-changing, life-altering, life-transformative experiences with LSD. Many have become, Christians or occultists or mystics, or they've gone into like protecting the environment, and it really changes their outlook on life. It spurs them on towards, cosmic consciousness. Now, you don't need LSD for that, but it almost seems like it's divinely appeared at the same time that we developed this terrible weapon. And then into this picture, Jim Morrison was also born in 1943. And then 3 years later, these Native American workers were the ones who were recruited in the area to build Los Alamos National Laboratory into a permanent installation. They thought that it was just, they called it the lab on the hill, and they thought it was just there temporarily. At the time, nobody knew what it was for. But after the bomb went off, it was like, wow, like that's where they built it. And the natives were not happy about that, They're not happy with this weapon that was created on their sacred lands, and you can imagine how they feel about that. So with Jim Morrison, it's almost as if the spirit world came to him. They came to this young person who is the son of this great military commander, and I write in the book, it's almost like they implanted in him that fighting warrior spirit for all that is sacred with the land and the world, and with that other reality that we can't lose. I tried, when I wrote the book, I didn't want to explain Jim Morrison, because that's just impossible.
Right.
At the beginning of the history of magic and the occult, which we'll get to, that Morrison found when he was a teenager, Kurt Seligman chose the opening quote for that book from Albert Einstein. The fairest thing that we can experience is the mysterious. And I think one of the genius things about Jim Morrison was he was able to artistically appropriate his powerful sense of mystery, artistically with rock. So I wanted, the book to unfold in a way that just kind of leaves you breathtaking, like with all these synchronicities and these affinities and all these parallels, And I think what happened in New Mexico was, one of the deeply mysterious things about it is that the spirit world came to Jim Morrison so young, and after doing my research, I agree with Jim Morrison. I think there was a spiritual indwelling that took place, and they did stay with him, for his life, because there's so many clues to a person going through a spiritual awakening that you find in all the biographies. I came across a book called The Stormy Search for the Self by Christine and Stanislav Grof, which is like probably the best book written about spiritual awakening. And everything they talk about in that book that people go through, it's all there in all the biographies about Jim Morrison's life as a teenager and going through college. This person was searching, this person was seeking, this person was being affected by the spiritual world, this person was journaling constantly to understand themselves this way. He had two girlfriends, and Tandy Martin and Mary Werbelow, that were spiritual concerned about him. One took him to a Presbyterian minister. The other took him to a church in Florida, to pray, to ask God to show Jim that he's real, that God is real. And they had this incredible experience in a Florida church that terrified him. This light that was like, expanding in the church, that they ran out terrified. And Mary Werbelow believes that her prayers were answered. And Jim Morrison said that, I don't know what that was, but it was real. And that experience in that church haunted him as much as the experience with the dying Native American Indians. You can read in his poetry, thank you, O Lord, for the white blind light this person had just extraordinary. These are two extraordinary spiritual experiences. You know, Jim Morrison was. We're talking about somebody who's a very spiritual person. Bill Siddons, their manager, said, you know, his concerns are of another world, not of mine. He did not get into rock and roll to get rich. He did not get into rock and roll to have houses and things and material stuff and status and look at me and narcissism. No. This person, like every past secret teacher, was looking for a way to express themselves, to get other people to see and feel what he was seeing and feeling. And since Jim Morrison was really brilliant and very creative, he saw that rock and roll was a new way to do that. If rock and roll hadn't existed, he would have turned to, you know, to experimental filmmaking, which is why he went to UCLA in the first place. Right. You know, painting and poetry, of course. He was a great poet. But rock and roll, he saw it as a way, especially with his, you know, being so rooted in primitivism, being so old that way, along with shamanism, you know, gave him the vehicle to open up this way. So with Jim Morrison, you get you know, 4 different huge aspects live. You get, you know, the Dionysian, you know, celebrating life and pain with the music, and you know, you get the secret teacher through like coming out, you know, with shamanism and waking up to the unseen, the spirit world. You know, you get the theater of the cruelty and the absurd, Antonin Artaud, which is to shock the audience and really get their participation in. And also, it's like, you know, it's like Bosch rock, where, you know, Jim Morrison's favorite artist is Hieronymus Bosch. He stood in front of the Garden of Earthly Delights, that painting in the Prado in Spain, for hours and hours when he was there with his girlfriend. You know, when you look at this painting, there's like, you know, one part of the triptych is, you know, they're in the garden and everybody's like naked and all that, and the other part, it's like hell, they're all being tortured. It's, you know, it's pleasure and pain, right? And Jim Morrison like even looks like a figure in a Hieronymus Bosch painting, like the way he you know, he carries himself on stage. So you have all of these things coming out and coalescing in Jim Morrison, right? And you know, the core of that is that spiritual center. So with to go back to the shamanism, you know, from the desert, that's extremely mysterious. And of course, shamanism is you know, a shaman is a person who heals the tribe. Right. With their techniques of ecstasy. And Jim Morrison's technique for ecstasy was, you know, rock and roll. You know, John Densmore behind him with the drums. Now, Jim Morrison got very, very lucky. John Densmore and Ray Manzarek and Robert Krieger, absolutely fantastic musicians. There's no band that's going to ever sound like the Doors, right? You have John Densmore back there with those drums while Jim is in his like shamanic paroxysms, and people in the audience, they did feel a sense of like a spiritual, you know, communalism, a kind of telepathy. At the same time, when they were interviewed, most of them said, many of them said, I have no idea what I just saw, but I know I saw something that I'm going to be thinking about for like a really long time. I mean, you know, you're not going to get instant spiritual enlightenment like going to see the Doors, but Jim Morrison really appropriated his energy to wake people up. So he screams, "Wake up!" Like you wake up at a Doors concert, right?
Mm-hmm. Very true, and I'm glad he picked rock and roll, because as I write in my Elvis book, people still or have forgotten that rock music really started out as a spiritual movement. Johnny Cash, Elvis, Little Richard, these guys were Pentecostals, and they were doing revival 10 stuff. And as scholars have noted, Pentecostalism is just Christian shamanism. Then it got commercialized, but then I think Jim really could tap into that primordial snake handling, we're going to hell kind of vibe, and he really innovated it. And of course, as you write in your book, and it's no secret, Jim was very influenced by Elvis. His singing, he liked the crooners, but Elvis was a big influence on him. And I'm also working on a David Bowie book, speaking of another shaman, except he's more science fiction. But it's interesting how they had the similar influences, Paul, because both David, like Jim, was very influenced by Colin Wilson and Jack Kerouac, and some of the similar sort of the counterculture stuff that was out there at the time. I mean, that was really big with Jim, for his waking up too. Again, Faculty X, the new existentialism, all that stuff that also blew Bowie away. William Burroughs, all that vibe.
Yes. When you speak of Faculty X, that's basically an idea that Colin Wilson came up with in 1966 when he was working in Washington State in America. It's basically like you go down like a time pocket where you basically feel very connected, like you're reliving certain historical events. Arnold Toynbee, the great historian, has many experiences like this that he's written about. With Jim Morrison, like you get a Faculty X experience because with him, you're taken right back into ancient times. Right. Jim Morrison was a very, very old soul, and he was all about things that were very, very old, like shamanism and, ancient Egypt. Like ancient Egypt didn't have religion. Ancient Egyptians were religion. They saw their land as a reflection of heaven, the land of Hermes Trismegistus, the land of as above, so below. These people, cosmic conscious wasn't an intellectual idea to find in reality. They were that. These people were living in cosmic consciousness. So with Jim Morrison, it becomes like a collective Faculty X that happens in Doors concerts. I imagine just hanging around him and being around him is to feel all of these things as well. With Faculty X, it's a heightening of reality of the world. And Colin Wilson makes light of Van Gogh's painting The Starry Night. Like it becomes just so alive. It's intertwined also with something called having peak experiences, which I think Jim Morrison had many, many of them. I want to go back to Elvis because I think this is really important because Jim Morrison really loved Elvis. I came across a video, a man named Ed Martin who was a roommate of his at FSU. And Jim Morrison gave him his copy of The History of Magic and the Occult 1963, wrote in the book, for Christmas. And I learned about this because he was auctioning it off at an auction, and it's on YouTube. And I immediately knew there was a connection between that book and what I just read. So with a lot of the things that that Elvis was into, they're very similar to what's going on in this book. And with the whole, I think the leather-clad image that Elvis had helped to give Jim Morrison an idea to form the idea of the Lizard King. Because the Lizard King is like, the lizard is very ancient. It's like it's very, very old. So it's a projection of the things that he's trying to bring back, and all wrapped up in this whole idea of like Faculty X, and everything like that. But to go back to what I said about Ed Martin, when they lived together, sometimes he had to go into Jim's room to turn down the transistor radio because he would wait up all night for a show in which they played nothing but Elvis songs.
Awesome.
Yeah, he really loved Elvis Presley. Jim Morrison, as a teenager, would go around Virginia, in Alexandria, Virginia, to all the blues bars and out-of-the-way places to hear the music. And that seems to be what Elvis did also as a child. So can you tell us if, as an aside, like, because this is really important, if the new film about Elvis, how do you feel about that film, or what's true, what's not true as it relates to all this?
Oh dear, I like what Baz Luhrmann did. He tried to squeeze it all in 2 hours, and he did a really good job. He obviously completely missed over Elvis's spirituality, Yogananda, occultism, studying Hermeticism, astrology, and all that he kind of threw that out. But I like the beginning about how much blues and gospel and Captain Marvel really affected Elvis's mind and so forth. And I think there's a lot, the abuse that he doesn't talk about with his mother, which I talk about in my book, very Oedipus. I think Jim had a problem with his father. I think that messed his head up. Elvis, it was his mother. And I don't think either one ever, Bowie too, his mother just effed his head up. And I don't think all three of them ever got over this archetypal kind of stuff, but that was glossed over. And a lot of scenes, are very fictional. Elvis never called out the colonel out in this. And he never, he was almost arrested a few times. And yes, the FBI, like Morrison, had a file on him. And The government was gunning. People forget how much, yes, the country loved Elvis, but there was part of the country that despised him and thought he was an existential threat. And there was never, he was threatened a few times by a judge that if you shake your hips or say this, you're going to get thrown in jail. And Elvis would just get up on stage and do this and talk shit about the judge, but he kept it pretty clean. So all in all, I think it's a pretty decent movie, Paul. Yeah. But again, there's just no way. There's so much about Elvis. You couldn't do it in a two, just like same with The Doors, the movie with Oliver Stone. You can do 15%, 10% if you're lucky. It's just that's how it is too. And
so when Jim,
sure,
go ahead. No, I was gonna say when Jim Morrison started college in St. Petersburg, Florida, when he's going to St. Petersburg Community College, which is where he met Mary Werbelow. He would go to the the weird, out of the way clubs around there too, and that's where he met a bar owner who said that you have the same it factor that Elvis Presley has, and that might have been something that stuck with Jim Morrison when he told him that when he was young. Jim Morrison did have that.
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. He definitely had that. Yeah, definitely an it factor. And again, both guys were very spiritual. Elvis was very, for him, it was all about seeking God, understanding. Like Jim, he was obsessed with death because of the death of his brother at birth. He loved native lore. I mean, there's a lot of parallels when I read your book and my book on Elvis too, which is uncanny. But again, sometimes fate does that. And as they say, as Paul Levy says, the wounded healer is the best shaman, and that's unfortunate. It's the broken ones that can heal because they're in so much pain. They know how to heal others. And unfortunately, Jim, Elvis, and even David Bowie was a very broken person, but they let this power come in because half of them is already in the land of the spirits, the land of the dead. So you make a good case. Even Paul, you talk about how he was into alchemy. And I love this quote. You quote his journal where he says, Alchemy offers man an original heroism. So he already knew about alchemy and the transformation and all that. I mean, and of course, as you say, he read Joseph Campbell. He knew of Castañedas. I mean, he knew all this Western esoteric shamanistic power, and he did something with it. He alchemized it to express an art to the world. And like you said, the Lizard King and Dionysus. What do you think? The Lizard King, and that's based on Dionysus, right? Because the serpent is associated with Dionysus, and he probably embraced that archetype too far, don't you think? As they say, you have to be careful with these archetypes because if these gods possess you, sometimes they don't let go, right, Paul? If you invite them in.
That's true. I do. So you just brought that up. That recalls something I wrote in the book about when one day he goes to Ray Manzarek and he says, "Listen, I don't know if I want to do this. I don't know if I want to carry on with this." And they were just beginning to get famous. And Ray Manzarek looked at him like, "You're crazy. Like, don't toss this now." And Jim Morrison said, "I don't know. That could be, one of the things is that he was feeling that, it's one thing to write about all these things and to feel all these things. It's another to become an avatar in your culture for the awakening of the spirit world this way." And I think he had second thoughts, but Jim Morrison had lots of second thoughts about a lot of different things that were going on at that time. It is reflecting. Well, it's kind of reflective of a scene in Lawrence of Arabia. I wrote this in my book, in which T.E. Lawrence, he tells General Allenby, like, "I don't want to go back out there. I'm done." And General Allenby says, "Listen, not too many people have the destiny. It'd be a terrible thing for man to flunk it if he has." Ray Manzarek more or less told Jim Morrison the same thing. Like, this, your destiny is basically unfolding, with the Doors, with rock and roll. Jim Morrison was very lucky to meet Ray Manzarek. Ray Manzarek was the one who saw the genius in Jim Morrison, who saw the talent, who saw the potential. But even more than that, Ray Manzarek saw the spiritual person. And Ray Manzarek had a really unified idea about what was going on in the world, and could see how Jim Morrison had a place in it. So that's kind of like it's kind of like a Horatio figure in Jim Morrison's life, as well as an older dad type person. But I'd say it's more like an Horatio figure. I see Jim Morrison as a Hamlet figure just because I really think Hamlet like predates modern man by 300 years, because this is a play in which the main character wakes up to the spirit world, and it dramatically changes his life, and it shocks him out of his grief. Aside from learning that your mother and your uncle murdered your father, to become the rulers of Denmark. He goes to Horatio and says, like, there's more things that are in this world that are dreamt of in your philosophy. He's very excited. I'm recalling like the Mel Gibson scene, from the film.
Yeah.
And he looks at Horatio, let's just give it a welcome, And that's what Jim Morrison did. He gave it a welcome. That's what everybody back then was doing, giving it a welcome in the 1960s. This is coming back again. Like we're giving it a welcome all over again. We're all Hamlets this way. We all are engaged with communication with spirits. We have spirit guides and angel numbers going on, and all of these things that we've given it a welcome. We have yet to see where all this is going to lead, so to speak. But I'm generally convinced it's part of our evolution, and that's the big story about Jim Morrison with the Western esoteric tradition. He's not just a secret teacher; he's one of the big ones. Because he's just out there in front of many people, expressing all this, and here we are 50 years later talking about him. 50 years from now, they're going to talk about him, and they're going to talk about him in the same way that we talk about all the other past secret teachers because of this. Because it's just such a momentous moment in human history. In the late 1800s, you have this first these people like Aleister Crowley and Madame Blavatsky and Rudolf Steiner, etc. They're starting to be fearless about their beliefs and about the other reality. Then you have World War I and World War II, and it kind of goes under. In the 50s, everyone is just trying to recover from the war. Then the 60s, it just explodes. Suddenly everybody is doing what those people did in the late 1800s. Now it's exploding even more. It's not, the Renaissances are no longer like around a city like Florence or Alexandria, San Francisco, New York, or Paris. We have cyberspace. So there's a renaissance taking place on cyberspace, such as conversations like this that are happening all over the world. So this is something that is becoming global.
Agreed.
It's just, I think, a reason why it's important that one of the reasons why I felt it was important to write this book is, as people are going through spiritual awakenings, they can share, they're discovering the doors, they can see that what Jim Morrison is going through reflects a lot about what they're going through. You can learn a lot from Jim Morrison about all of this stuff, and you can learn a lot about what's happening, in the world right now. And you talked about Petrarch and Mount Vento, and in the 1300s, he goes to the top, and so Jean Gebser, he wrote The Ever-Present Origin, and Gary Lackland talks about it in The Secret Teachings of the Western World. That's how I discovered the whole structures of consciousness. So when Petrarch climbs that mountain, Gebser sees that as the beginning of the breakdown of the mental rational structure of consciousness. Because Petrarch goes up there and he works hard to get to the summit. Many people discouraged him from climbing that mountain, people have died, etc. He wasn't prepared for how that view was going to affect him when he got to the top. It just really changed, and it haunted him for the rest of his life. And he goes back down and he writes in his journals, and of course he feels guilt and shame because it's a worldly experience, and all that sort of religious Christian stuff, right, that was going on back then in the Roman Catholic Church. It really changes. And now we're moving into something called the integral structure of consciousness, which unites all those past structures of consciousness. And I think that's what Jim Morrison was poetically expressing when he said, let's reinvent all the gods, all the myths of the ages, celebrate symbols from deep elder forests. That is a beautiful poetic expression of an integral structure of consciousness that unites the archaic, the magical, the mythical, and the mental rational, all coming together. I think Jim Morrison detected the same kind of change in consciousness through all of his reading and all of his journaling that that Jean Gebser did when he came across Rilke's poetry. That's what cued him in that there's a great change in consciousness that was happening. And Jim Morrison, he witnessed an actual renaissance. Like when he began his high school years in Alameda, and across the bay, that's where Lawrence Ferlinghetti had, his City Lights books. Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg and Michael McClure were all present when Ginsberg read Howl in 1955. That was organized by Lawrence Ferlinghetti. Jim Morrison had this friend with a funny name, Fudd Ford. They'd go into town and hang out at City Lights books, and even to know when he gets out alive, you read that Jim Morrison was so freaked out when he met Lawrence Ferlinghetti that he ran off, right? So all that was going on back then. Michael McClure was the one. So Jim was really lucky to meet Ray Manzarek for rock and roll, but with his poetry, Jim Morrison was very lucky to become friends with Michael McClure. It was Michael McClure who discovered his poems, thought they were just beautiful and amazing. He should be published. And when Jim Morrison received his book from Simon and Schuster, The Lords and the New Creatures, he was practically in tears, and he looked at Michael McClure and said, "This is the first time I don't feel like I've ever been fucked over." But that was his dream, to have his poems published that way.
Yeah, he's a great poet. His poetry could stand alone easily without the music. I want to get to Vance in a second, but I want to deal with something because every time at the corner of my eye, I look at the chat. If I see CIA or MK Ultra one more time, I'm going to scream because Jim Morrison triggers people. But I'm sure you're familiar with David McGowan's book, right? And the idea that obviously Jim Morrison's father was in charge of one of the greatest false flag operations. And so now it's become trendy to think that Jim might have been a creation of his father to corrupt. Have you heard that conspiracy, Paul?
Yes. So let's talk about this for a minute. Let's go down this rabbit hole for a moment. So I was fortunate enough to become friends with a man named Tom O'Neill. We met at a bus stop one night. We recognized each other here in West LA.
Who wrote Chaos?
Yeah, Chaos.
Oh, wow.
And actually, the story is that I met someone that was friends with him, and they wanted to introduce us. And then he told me to watch his show with Joe Rogan, where he talks about MK Ultra, which is extremely fascinating.
Yeah.
And then I was waiting for the bus one night. It was just him there at the bus stop at the Grove here in West Hollywood, and I recognized him, the Joe Rogan show. I'm like, "Are you Tom O'Neill?" He's like, "Are you Paul Wyld?" And that's how we met. So that book
is
is
synchronicity. You can't say
yes,
it's an accident.
yes, it took Tom 20 years to write that book, and I think it's the most responsible, most informative, most mature book that has been published about MK Ultra.
Yeah.
Now, so a lot of rock stars have, military fathers, like David Crosby. I think he did, or others, etc.
Frank Zappa.
And much
there's a lot of them.
And much has been made about this, this army military base, whatever, that was located in Laurel Canyon, etc., and so forth.
That's it.
So the core, one of the cores of MK Ultra before that was when the CIA got a hold of LSD, they tried to turn it into a truth serum. It didn't work. You know what was happening? Their agents were leaving the agency. They discovered God. They wanted nothing to do with it. And then they tried the same.
Perception were open.
That's right. They tried the same thing with those with using prostitutes to lure men into the hotel rooms in San Francisco to study them, to see how LSD and controlling people could have benefit them this way. One of the ironies that America's top spy after World War II, I forget his name, he became a big champion of the spiritual aspects of LSD, and he introduced the actor Cary Grant to LSD, and Cary Grant had 60 LSD trips that said really helped him.
Yeah, Cary Grant had a horrible childhood too, so good. Yeah.
LSD was used to great success with alcoholics, in Canada. It
Bill
was outlawed.
The founder of AA, went to LSD treatment. Yeah, you're right.
That's right. It was outlawed in California on October 6, 1966. Jim Morrison bought tons and tons of LSD when you can buy it legally over the counter. So it didn't have the desired use that the CIA was looking. So after World War II, they were looking for all this kind of stuff to see how they can create something that's based on mind control.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the crux of everything that goes on with MK Ultra. Richard Helms and all those people, and all that material that came to light in the 1970s. That's still, I think, mysterious. I still think we haven't gotten down to the bottom of that. I do think Tom O'Neill's book, Chaos, is a really big step on that ladder, with it. But I don't think Jim Morrison at all was any kind of mind-controlled, person whatsoever. This is a person who, like all secret teachers, they guarded their mind. They had statements in his poetry, like, do you know that we are ruled by TV? Jim Morrison was very, very aware of the power of television, the power of the media, the power of all those forces that that can control the mind. And he saw, I think what happened with Jim Morrison is that you can tell him Notes on Vision, the first part of his poetry book, where he talks a lot about alchemy. They're very astute observations with alchemy's relationship with experimental cinema. And then at the end of Notes on Vision, you suddenly have these thoughts about shamanism, and he sees shamanism, as a way that can heal people. It's a technique that needs to come back, in that it can reawaken us back, to our divine selves and the spiritual realm, and where we're at right now. And it kind of appears in Notes on Vision as like the answer. The clue, the way to do things. And he said later, you can read this in the Collected Works of Jim Morrison. He said when he wrote that, he didn't realize that just 2 or 3 years later he'd be doing exactly that with the Doors. There is nothing about Jim Morrison that is mind control. There isn't anything about Jim Morrison that is satanic. There isn't anything about Jim Morrison that is, rebel angels, demonic angels, all these kinds of things, controlling his life, all of his stuff. He was someone who was interested in the dark side of life, but in a way that has more to do with shadow work than anything else.
Right.
Like a lot of the Doors is like Jim Morrison, but going through shadow work and all those types of things.
Writing about serial
side.
killers and murders. Yeah, it's normal. People do it in podcasts every day.
That's right. I mean, with Jim Morrison, you get someone, it's not just like, peace, love, and flowers and all that like back then, but with Jim Morrison, like he was looking at all aspects of life. Now, it wasn't just like, joyful and happy and everything like that. Like, life is very dark and it's very tragic. And it's like James Joyce said, like life is filled with joy and terror. Yeah, that's what the Doors are. The Doors music is filled with joy and terror, and Jim Morrison was very aware of all of that. But no, Jim Morrison was not an MK Ultra mind controlled rock star at all.
Yeah, somebody in the chat, Jim worship Dionysus. I gotta put this up. Whom is the devil? All right, we got a live one here. Yes, sure, Dionysus is Satan. Yes. That's a complete lack of understanding of religion, mythology, and just theology in general. But you do you, man. Vance, do you have any questions, or are you MK Ultra now? Come on.
Well, I'm going to sound like MK Ultra. I don't think Jim Morrison was, hooked up with the CIA. His life was too chaotic. But although you may disagree with me, Paul, that his life was chaotic, but I grew up in the 60s. I played the Doors music in my high school rock band and all that stuff. And I always felt that I enjoyed the music and the lyrics a little bit because it was different. It wasn't the same old British invasion stuff. It was more I don't know, it was more melodic and so forth. The music wasn't chaotic, and a lot of the music that would come later on, 60s, 70s would become chaotic. But I have trouble, and please try to explain this to me. Maybe you can quote some lyrics or something, why he was a teacher, because it seemed to me that his life, I think you've convinced me that he had a big spiritual side, and I'm sure it came out in the poetry and so forth and some of the lyrics. But his early death and the way he treated his life, his own life, didn't seem to me to be a good example or something where he was deliberately teaching. I suppose he could learn a lot by studying him, as you have, but how was he a teacher? You know, like Manly Hall was a teacher, or, you know, Madame Blavatsky was a teacher.
That's a really great question. So, in kind of bringing up Shakespeare's Hamlet and talking about Hamlet, there's a book that the literary critic Harold Bloom wrote called Hamlet Unlimited, where he discusses the play. And Bloom writes that Hamlet had something called an authorial consciousness, that you just want to quote him on everything. And Jim Morrison had the same authorial consciousness. You know, his quotes are fantastic. You know, for somebody who is like, you know, between 20 and 26 years old, when, you know, 21 and 26 when the doors are flying, you know, this person had an extraordinary insights about life, with extraordinary wisdom about life. You know, he was well beyond his years. I mean, intellectually, I'd say Jim Morrison, when he graduated UCLA, had the intellectual maturity of a 35 to 40-year-old with a PhD. That's the person that I discovered, you know, through my research. So in all of these interviews, you know, he has so many things to say about life that are just so empowering. They're just so wise, and they're also very prophetic. You know, like one of them, he said that he felt that in the future, the art form is going to be the interview. You know, here we are. You know, YouTube is just nothing but podcasts and interviews. He's right about that.
Yeah.
You know, he foresaw a lot of things this way. As far as being like an outright teacher, like he once said, like, you know, if I wasn't doing this, I'd probably be like, you know, a sociology professor or someone like that. So with I guess what you want to say with being a secret teacher is that, well, first of all, you know, regarding the occult, those things were kept secret for so long because of persecution that could result. Also, there's a strong feeling that the rejected knowledge, the lunar knowledge, just, you know, you don't want to, like, you know, pearls before swine, you know, that kind of thing. You want to keep something sacred. And I think Jim Morrison found something quite sacred when he discovered Kurt Sullivan's book, The History of Magic and the Occult, which discusses the Western esoteric tradition, and it includes Jim Morrison into who he really was. And this goes back to something really central about him, is that he loved Alexander the Great.
Yeah.
He really admired him. And Alexander the Great had Aristotle for a teacher. And Aristotle put in Alexander's mind as a boy that all human beings have a very strong desire to know. Like, that's central to human nature. We're very curious. We want to know. We want to know about that other reality as well. And Alexander remembered this. And after he conquered Egypt, you know, he created the city of Alexandria, you know, the first city in Egypt, not built on the Nile, but on the Mediterranean coast, that was in honor of what Aristotle taught him as a boy. I mean, that library that stood for centuries is the birthplace of the Western esoteric tradition. That was a place that Alexander wanted people to come from all over the world, scholars and artists and all these spiritual people to meet, exchange ideas, so we can grow, you know, we can evolve this way. That's a place where Jim Morrison, I write about this in the book, that's a place where Jim Morrison, I felt, would have felt right at home. And I make the point in my book where in high school, you know, when Jim Morrison graduated high school, he had over 1,000 books in his room. Not just any books, like he read things that were very dense,
high
very
IQ.
difficult.
Very high IQ. Mm-hmm.
When he graduated high school, his sister said that, you know, most kids, they want a car or a trip to Europe. And Jim Morrison asked his parents for like the full volume set of Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy. These are not typical things. So here you have Jim Morrison, who's there in Alexandria, Virginia. He finds The History of Magic and the Occult, written by Kurt Seligman, in a local Alexandria branch library that talks all about the Western esoteric tradition, that's birthplace is in the city of Alexandria, that Alexander the Great founded. And he's at this point in his teenage years, his spiritual awakening is really starting to blossom. There are all kinds of things that his behavior, as described in No One Here Gets Out Alive, matches a lot of what Christine and Stanislav Grof say is indicative of a person going through a spiritual awakening in their book, The Stormy Search for the Self. So he's reading all of this stuff. at the same, with his own personal Alexandria-like library in his room, because this person is like a lot of these people that he's reading about in this book. Jim Morrison is also he's the son of a military leader. So is Alexander the Great. His father was Philip II of Macedon. Jim Morrison's father, he's a movie into himself. This is a person who graduated from Annapolis. They were present at Pearl Harbor the day it was bombed. He flew Hellcat fighters in the Navy during World War II. He commanded his first aircraft carrier, the USS Bonhomme Richard, when Jim Morrison was going into UCLA. It was his aircraft carrier group that was present at the Gulf of Tonkin that started off the Vietnam War. I mean, there's a whole, you could write a whole book about George Morrison. This is a person you want defending your country. Now, they're very, very different people, Jim Morrison and his father. Jim Morrison called his father the commander, growing up. He had a respect for his dad, but Jim Morrison was very, very different. His father didn't really understand him. This was an abusive household. Clara Morrison did the best she could. She was attracted to a military man, and she didn't marry an artist, but her eldest son, is an artist, right? So that was kind of difficult. The father's away a lot, out at sea. He left Jim Morrison like, the man at home, everything like that. But Jim Morrison had the same strong sense of duty to his secret teacher's mission to wake us up to cosmic consciousness in our divine selves, as his father had to protect the United States of America. This was the son of someone who was a great military commander. At the time, there's only 8 aircraft carriers. Today, there's 10. Back when Jim Morrison was alive, an American aircraft carrier is this country's like projection of its power. Only 8 people are in charge of that. That's a very, very exclusive club. And this is the stuff that Jim Morrison is cut from. They gave him the middle name Douglas because that was in honor of General Douglas MacArthur. His father knew, General MacArthur, the great hero of the Pacific Theater, in World War II. So Jim Morrison was someone who, took all of this stuff about himself, to make us aware of this other reality. And in his interviews and in his books and in his lyrics and in his poetry, particularly his poetry, you can see the secret teacher coming out and showing us that there is another reality that we have to wake up to. We have to go into this integral structure of consciousness, as very awake people. And if we don't do that, we're gonna experience something called that slide into the Gulf that Gary Lackner writes about in his biography about Colin Wilson, Beyond the Robot. So in that way, Jim Morrison was a teacher, and a very powerful one, actually.
Seems incidental as opposed to deliberate. That's kind of the impression I get. I mean, I'm sure internally he had all this stuff going on, but it seems like, and he was in the band and he wrote the lyrics. And I don't know about how much did he publish his poetry? Did it, how was that discovered? How was his poetry discovered?
So, well, Ray Manzarek was familiar with Jim Morrison's poetry, but it was published by Simon and Schuster thanks to the beat poet Michael McClure. So they were in the Doors were in London, and Michael McClure is a guest on Jim Morrison's and Pamela Curson's Belgravia apartment, and his poetry was on the table that morning. And Michael McClure discovered it, thought it was absolutely marvelous, and helped Jim Morrison to get it published with Simon and Schuster. And it came out in 1969, 1970. The Lords and the New Creatures. So the first part of his poetry is this long poem he wrote mostly when he was at UCLA called Notes on Vision, which is filled with very astute observations about alchemy's relationship to experimental film, about history, about the dark side of like urban America. It's pretty amazing, actually. Shamanism. And then The New Creatures is just replete with images that very reminiscent of the surrealist painters and poets that Jim Morrison really loved, especially with the entire French tradition, like after Charles Baudelaire and Arthur Rimbaud, etc. Also, it's very reminiscent of the abstract expressionism movement that grew out of New York City when all the surrealist painters, moved to New York to escape the Nazis, and they intermingled their ideas with the natives, like Jackson Pollock. And then out of that, you have abstract expressionism. Now, Jackson Pollock is basically just shamanism, on canvas. That's an expression of the spiritual world coming alive on campus that we enjoy with Jackson Pollock.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And yeah, for the record, I like Dave McGowan's book, Programmed to Kill, and everything else. I'm going to say that. Oh, yeah, he does great work. I would probably fall on your camp, Paul, that Morrison probably wasn't. I wouldn't put Zappa, even though Zappa's father was also intelligent. It was Zappa's father. But when it comes to the Grateful Dead and Charles Manson, I would roll the dice that there were CIA ops. But again, I am just speculating and so forth because
well, after reading Chaos, I would have to agree that there's a lot of smoke there, but there's also a lot of fire.
Yeah, and again, it's hard to tell. We're not there, but if I was a betting man, I would say so too. So, but again, that's a tale as old as time. And military intelligence will try to go to the mystics, whether it's for, remote viewing, magic, poisons. You know what I mean? It's happened all throughout history. Whether you're Swedenborg or Pythagoras. The government wants to use your powers and your ability to control minds. It's the way the cookie crumbles. So you just never know when the CIA is going to tap into you because they know you have power over people. And the CIA does believe in the spiritual world. I think MK Ultra knows that there are portals, there are entities up there, and we want the shamans to bring them down. So they can do our bidding. But I know I'm getting too esoteric here, but
no, not at all. That actually brings up a lot of things that come into my mind with what you're saying. Is maybe one of the reasons why the United States government came down on Jim Morrison then is they couldn't control him. Perhaps they attempted to control him in such a way where they wanted to do all these things. That was the goal of the whole MK Ultra project.
Right.
Maybe it backfired like it backfired on them with LSD.
Yeah.
So there's a quote in that Claudia says in Hamlet. Madness and great ones must not unwatched go.
Yeah.
And that was never more true for Jim Morrison. So there's a very interesting YouTube video where you can see where Jim Morrison is talking to a man named Pastor Fred Stagmeyer. And you can also, in the same video, you can see Harrison Ford walk by Jim Morrison because Harrison Ford was a roadie with the Doors and helped them with
I didn't know
documentary. That. Yep. Pastor Stagmeyer, he sees what Jim Morrison is doing, what he's trying to bring back with the Doors. And he sees what's going to eventually, happen to Jim Morrison. Pastor Stagmeyer is much older than him. He warns him. He says, listen, the establishment has their eye on what you're doing. They see what you're doing and what's going on here. So in Miami, when they, falsely convicted him of exposing himself to the audience, he showed up drunk that night. And Robert Krieger makes the point in his book, Set the Night on Fire, that the one charge they did drop was the one he was actually guilty of, which is public drunkenness. So the concert happens on March 1st, 1969 at Dinner Key Auditorium in Miami. It's very famous in the movie, etc. and so forth, that Oliver Stone made. 5 days later, when the warrants were issued, the FBI field office in Miami sent a memo directly to J. Edgar Hoover's office with their description of the show, saying that Jim Morrison did expose himself. Now, during the trial, over 10,000 photographs were submitted as evidence. Not one showed him expose himself to the audience, and there was not one eyewitness account of someone recalling that he had exposed himself that night. But yet, he was still convicted. The judge during that trial, Benny Goodman, a few years later, he lost his judgeship, for corruption. So that trial, there's problems there. Charlie Crist, the governor of Florida in 2010, went to the Florida Clemency Board and said, "Let's review all of this," and they quickly said, "This is garbage," and they threw out his conviction.
Yeah.
How did the jury, take that all in? If there's no evidence, what was going on with the jury?
Boy, that's a good question. So it was a 3-man, 3-woman jury at the time, 6 people. So how they came down with this verdict is a question I have as well. I don't know how that happened.
You don't play ball, they're going to put the pressure on you. And they know if you're a sensitive soul, somebody like Jim, he's on the edge, he can go either way. All it takes is a few tragedies, a few accusations. I mean, they've done that. I mean, they're masters of psychology. So I wouldn't be surprised. I would not be surprised at all.
Who defended him? Who was his lawyer?
His lawyer was
from
The
Simpsons. The idiot from The Simpsons.
His lawyer was someone that was really good. He had a funny name. His name was Max Fink, and he was very good to Jim Morrison. He was very good for the Doors, and he did the best that he could. Now, Jim Morrison wasn't the first person to run into problems in Miami. In 1925, Paramahansa Yogananda was touring the country, and the one city that gave him a problem was Miami. And in Miami, they accused him of having a love cult going on, and they ordered him, and the mayor and everyone ordered him out of the city, like he got ran out of there.
Wow.
I mean, I go and I meditate sometimes at the Self-Realization Center that he founded here in Pacific Palisades. I've had like really beautiful experiences, meditating there.
Yeah, Elvis used to go there all the time. He was friends with Dayamata, Yogananda's successor. Yeah.
That's very, very interesting. I did not know that at all. I'm very much looking forward to reading your book on Elvis. Like that's very fascinating.
Oh yeah, well, it's part of. I think there's a movement. I mean, we had. I think there's something in the air, Paul. Like this year, we had Julian Gordon Bremer, the Occult Sylvia Plath.
I think
these are coming because I think people, you are always like, oh, well, Sylvia Plath just dabbled in the stuff, and Elvis just and Jim Morrison just and it's like, no. This stuff formed their personalities. It wasn't,
It's not surprising because pretty much, all of the artistic activity going on before rock music has its roots in the primitive, in the occult, in the esoteric. Yeah. It's a very large part of it. Symbolist poetry, surrealism, cubism, abstract expressionism, experimental filmmaking. A lot of this is expressions of this unseen world that we're starting, to wake up to. So, you have the Italian Renaissance where they got the Corpus Hermeticum, and Cosimo de' Medici was the great financial power who loved the arts, and right. And really fostered Leonardo da Vinci, and like had Marsilio Ficino interpret the Corpus Hermeticum like into Latin, etc., and so forth. But 200 in the time since then, from like the 1600s up until the late 1800s, for that frame of time, suddenly, any idea about cosmic consciousness, any understanding of an unseen world, a spirit world, all this kind of stuff was seen as like, you're insane, you're criminal, and the Roman Catholic Church was just not going to have that, and the Inquisition was a big part of this kind of thing, and as all that began to die out, in the late 1800s, people were starting to wake up to this again, and they're becoming more fearless, about expressing themselves. Of course, they ran into persecution in society and everything like that, and then you have this explosion with rock and roll. But rock and roll is another artistic form that attracts people, spiritual people like Jim Morrison, and it seems like Elvis Presley as well. So
yeah, don't forget it's based on the blues. The blues was not even a music form. It really was about going to the crossroads and meeting this figure. I mean, you call him the devil, but he wasn't. He was more of a trickster spirit, and making maybe a deal. He would teach you something. Robert Johnson. It was very much a spiritual system for African Americans. It wasn't, just I'm just going to play some music. It was so, and of course, gospel was very important to rock music, and them, they were doing what Dionysus was doing. They were shaking and handling snakes.
Yes. So with the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, they invented, the mind, rationality, but they also knew that there was a place where the mind ultimately can't understand the irrational. Mm-hmm. We don't know why Oedipus, kills his father and sleeps with his mother. So you have the tragic chorus that sings about this.
Like the song, in the end, same thing, right? Mm-hmm. the guy
Jim Morrison doesn't. Yes, exactly. And Jim Morrison doesn't understand why do these spirits inhabit my body? Like, what is going on here? And he celebrates and deals with this through poetry. Indians scattered on dawn's highway bleeding, ghosts crowd the young child's fragile eggshell mind. It's the ghosts, just like in Hamlet. It's a ghost. It's a ghost that comes to him, right? So you celebrate these things because your rational mind can't deal with it. It's pain. It's the same thing with this. The root of rock music are slaves, singing at night, when they weren't, enduring their terrible lives during the day, working on these plantations. That's how they dealt with the terror and pain of slavery. It was the release through song and music, and that's, to me, is the spiritual core of rock music.
Hit it on the head, and that's exactly, again, what Little Richard and Elvis and that first wave was tapping into, and they knew it too. And then, of course, you have the second wave, and it expands in spirituality. But what I wanted to ask you too is also the idea, when I'm researching Elvis and now I'm researching Bowie, it's very hard because, again, I see two children that were broken. I see two adults that were in a lot of pain. And they never, Elvis obviously never got over it, although he knew he was going to die. I show in the book, he knew what was going to happen. I show in the book that shamans across the world becoming drug addicts is actually very common because going into the spirit world takes its toll. Healing takes its toll eventually. But the difference is that the tribe supports the shaman when he's just a drug addict babbling in the corner, because they know he can still fulfill his duties. But it's still heartbreaking because I don't like to see these sensitive, brilliant men who were hurt as children being in so much pain, and that they had, again, Bowie went through a lot of drug addiction and alcoholism. Elvis did it. Do you feel the same way about Jim? Like, it's just, I know people say with Elvis when he died, good career move. I'm sure they did the same way with Jim Morrison. And you have people saying, well, we don't want to see an old fat Jim Morrison in the disco era, so it was better if he died. I don't agree, because I think he should have lived his life and had a chance to just been happy. Do you feel that way too, Paul?
Disco
absolutely. There's a really heartbreaking video that I found where I think it was the Doors' secretary, where one night Jim Morrison, towards the time when he was leaving for Paris, he asked her, like, can I come with you tonight to your family's house to have dinner? Like, I just want to sit down with the family and be like a normal human being and have dinner. And she was very apprehensive about it because, his mug is plastered all over the 6 o'clock news because of the Miami thing. And she doesn't know what her family is going to think about him when she brings him over. But she relents. She sees that he just wants to have a warm evening in a family setting. And there's pictures of Jim Morrison. They're enjoying a meal with her family around the kids and being really happy. And if Jim Morrison was able to somehow get past all of that, I think he'd have been a good dad and a good husband. I think there would have been, there's a good possibility there would have been a reconciliation between him and his parents. Men don't really grow up until about 30 years old anyway, That's my opinion.
Right.
But anyway, it's so when you go back to what you're saying before about what the destruction that comes to these very sensitive people, these tough childhoods. In Jim Morrison's case, in a lot of the cases, a lot of these spiritual rock stars like Elvis, there's a lot of spiritual electricity coming through you when you wake up and you're an awakened person. And Henry Miller, to me, is like the first American beatnik. You know, in his book that he wrote about Arthur Rimbaud called Time of the Assassins, he writes that the artists and writers of his time were discovering spiritual electricity, but they just didn't know anything about installation. I mean, a spiritual awakening is a very powerful thing for a person to go through.
Right.
You know, it just really just jars and rocks your entire world. And depending on how strong you are characterologically, mentally, and so forth, you know, who knows, you know, what you can do. In Jim Morrison's case, or what you will do, in Jim Morrison's case, there is a lot of spiritual electricity going through this person. He told Frank Lysandra one day, like, I drink to shut the demons up in my mind. Like they really want me to respond, you know, creatively, etc. At the same time, he had a Dionysian personality, and it's a Dionysian trait for someone who has that archetype, you know, to want to heighten all of their experiences, peak experience, rock experiences, sexual experiences, you know, with drugs, you know, with alcohol in particular, right? Plus, you're very young, you're full of energy. Jim Morrison did the butterfly stroke, which is very, very hard. This person had great physical stamina. Okay. They slammed decades of living in just like 6 years. Like normally, most of us would just be dead. if we did as many drugs as, like, you know, Jim Morrison, we wouldn't last a year. You know what I mean? So when Ian Astbury from the Cult went on tour with the Doors, the 21st Century Doors, he said in an interview, like, I could feel like what it must have been like for Jim Morrison to be at that part of the diamond of the Doors out there up front with those three amazing musicians around you, all that spiritual, like, electricity coming through you, you know? I make the point in my book, like, you know, Ram Dass says it's just volts, like hundreds and hundreds, like the voltage that's coming through you. This is going to have its toll. This is going to, like, you know, take its toll if you don't have a sense of balance about your awakening and, you know, all the research and all the books that you do and the things that you're opening yourself up to. It doesn't mean that you throw everything else out about life that is more left brain. Like, spiritual awakening and all that has a lot to do with the right brain, you know, waking up. And I mean, there's so many right brain things going on right now. It's like, you know, suddenly UFOs are legitimate. The U.S. government is talking about it. Everybody's talking about it in the media. Like, you know, there's just so many things that are changing so fast that have had so much to do with the right brain. Like, you know, like Carl Jung saying that, you know, our whole perception of UFOs, like, you know, has a lot to do with our unconscious and things like that. You know, it's still all, you know, deeply mysterious. But, you know, to go back to what you're saying with these sensitive people, you know, with these tough childhoods and, you know, that the ends that they come to. In Jim Morrison's case, the Morrison household, like I said, was not abusive. It's just that Jim Morrison was a person with a destiny. He was a spiritual person with a destiny as a secret teacher. He had a father who was a military leader with enormous responsibility who just was not at home, and a mother who married a military man and not an artist. So she just didn't really understand her son, you know, that much. Did they make mistakes? Of course they did. Like, I'm a parent. Like, you know, we all make mistakes.
Right. Of course.
You know, and just like all of the secret teachers, you know, his spiritual awakening, great secret teachers, his spiritual awakening began when he was very young. So Jim Morrison was seeking out time alone to read and to journal and to really open himself up. He was very guarded about letting people into that world. He went to his high school girlfriend, Tandy Martin, says, I got a problem that I don't want to talk to about my parents or anybody else, not even you. So she takes him to a Presbyterian minister. And to this day, we don't know what that conversation was about, but I'm leaning towards some of it must have been about the things that were happening in Jim Morrison, the changes in consciousness that he was experiencing. He was going to the Library of Congress, checking out 14th and 15th century books on demonology.
Wow.
You know, he was reading all the time. He was telling his teachers, you know, whoppers in class, like, I'm going to go have a brain tumor removed today. And he'd leave class just to go read. Like, the most popular fraternity in high school, like, said, hey, like, Jim Morrison was a very, very funny, gregarious person. Like, people really liked this guy a lot. He's hilarious to hang with. And the most popular fraternity at George Washington High School wanted him to join. He said, no, I don't want to. that's not a typical thing for a teenager to do. Like a teenager would just feel great to belong, something like, be on your own, but not Jim Morrison. Jim Morrison was someone going through a spiritual awakening where all he wanted to do is read, paint, write in his journals. He loved Franz Kafka, who that's where he got the idea to keep journals, because Franz Kafka, journaled a great deal. So you have this person, 4 years of high school, 4 years of college, intensely reading, intensely journaling, asking like very, very deep questions, taking deep dives into Friedrich Nietzsche. From Friedrich Nietzsche, Jim Morrison got like the courage to go be himself. He who has a why can endure any how. Then Jim Morrison found his why, and then he went and he endured, how he was going to do it. It's a path that's not for the faint of heart. And I think that's why he liked Friedrich Nietzsche a lot, because Friedrich Nietzsche was someone who you don't really get a sense of like the esoteric and the occult and all that in Friedrich Nietzsche, but he doesn't write about it explicitly or anything like that. But I think it's there with him in a different way. I think he has a very his existential way of approaching that, the way how he writes about it, in his philosophy. This guy was basically the first beatnik. Like he leaves college at age, very young, and travels all around Europe and lives in the most beautiful places and writes like, books that, don't sell at all in his time, that become like these great, landmarks of consciousness, later on. Nietzsche said he felt he would not be understood until, the first quarter of the 21st century. And here we are living in Friedrich Nietzsche's world. It's like Nietzsche's really, when you read his books, like I feel like we're not reading him, he's reading us. So
I think that Presbyterian minister heard Jim Morrison tell the story about the Indians on the road, and the minister told him that he was demonically possessed, because that's how a Christian Orthodox person would think. And I bet you Jim Morrison then took off and investigated it for himself to see, well, what does that mean? What is demonic possession, and so forth? And he didn't swallow it whole. Oh no, I'm possessed by the devil. I bet you that's something very likely what happened.
It possibly. So I haven't read anything in all the books written about Jim Morrison that alludes to, gives any evidence that the Morrison family was a church-going family, that they went to church on Sunday, or Jim Morrison went to Sunday school, or anything like that. And I can't find anywhere in any of the literature on Jim Morrison that says anything about the extent of Jim Morrison's understanding of things that were biblical. But I get a sense in his poetry that this is someone that he was quite aware of Christian scripture, and that experience that he had with Mary Werbelow at that church in Florida really haunted him, and that maybe perhaps that part of the spiritual world was coming to him to let him know that we care about you, we love you, etc., and so forth. I don't sometimes, like on the Soft Parade, when Jim Morrison, this is a really, really big thing. This is a very divisive kind of thing that a lot of Doors fans don't want to hear people like that. But what I love about Jim Morrison is that he invites it all in. And he also has questions about that side of the spiritual realm. Like when at the beginning of the Soft Parade, when he screams, "You can't petition the Lord with prayer," there's a lot of things going on here. This isn't just about some rebellion. This isn't just about spiritual rebellion. This is about what goes on in all of us. We all want to be our own best version of ourselves, but at the same time, like there's this statement in the Bible that we all, our best version falls very, very short at the same time. That we're all together just vanity. And Jim Morrison was very aware of this. He said that one of the biggest mistakes that he made was posing for rock photographs. Like he has to look at that later on in life. He doesn't want to be remembered for his carnal self. He wants to be remembered for the spirituality in his poetry and his art. That's what was most important to him. I mean, Jim Morrison wasn't always like the live, sexy figure that he was. Like for most of his life, he was, pudgy and overweight, and he lost a lot of weight, but then he gained it back. He wasn't like Mick Jagger. Mick Jagger was naturally slim, and also Mick Jagger's father was a phys ed teacher. So it was, put into Mick Jagger's mind at a very young age to take care of yourself. That's why you go on YouTube, you'll see him exercising 3.5 hours a day because he's hardwired that way, right? But to go back to what I was saying with all of this, I think Jim Morrison had a lot of questions and felt a lot of confusion about God, the Trinity, Jesus Christ, the Holy Spirit, the whole 9 yards, etc. He probably felt that maybe there was something beyond what he was discovering, through drugs and shamanism and things like that. And he was open to that. Like there's a picture of him in a New York subway where he has a hat on, and there's a poster about the New York Bible Society, about coming to God and all that. And there's a profile of Jim Morrison in the side of this picture. And a lot of people think it's like a mocking thing. I don't think it is at all. I don't think it is at all. I think that it's a reflection of his confusion. And this is an artist who agreed with Jack Kerouac, like, all I have to offer you is my confusion. And I also think when he's saying, like, and you can't petition the Lord with prayer, this also might be someone who's trying to convince themselves of something that they know is not true. This person might possibly be going really way overboard to just not want to have to maybe acknowledge that Christ is real, that he can be saved. But it comes out, and when the music's over, cancel my subscription to the resurrection, send my credentials to the house of detention. And then at the end of the song, he's screaming for Jesus to save him. Save us, Jesus, save us. So it's almost like Jim Morrison is saying, we're going to be our best version of ourselves. We're going to wake up, and we're going to have cosmic consciousness, and we're going to save our world, and we're going to save this planet, and we want it now, and all this. But he may be acknowledging at the same time that we may be at a place where, wow, we can't do it without God's help either. It seems that he admits this in certain ways. Who knows? Everything with Jim Morrison is very strange.
People are strange.
It all remains a mystery.
Faces come out of the rain.
When he wrote that song, this is another very, very clue about who Jim Morrison was. Jim Morrison read Colin Wilson's The Outsider in high school. And that's Colin Wilson's first book about the classic romantics. And Colin Wilson was very fascinated with why they would have these really high highs, he called peak experiences, and then they would have these low lows in which you become suicidal and get into drugs and all that kind of stuff. Jim Morrison was no different. In a documentary you can find on YouTube called Jim Morrison 3 Hours for Magic, Robert Krieger talks about one night in Laurel Canyon, him and John Densmore were sharing a house, and Jim Morrison was there that night, and he was suicidal that night. He was really talking about ending it. He thought everything was pointless and absurd to go on, and etc. And they spent the night talking him out of it. And Robert Krieger mentions that they spent a few times, talking him out of ending his life. And then just before the sun came up, he went for a walk. And then he came back a short time later, completely euphoric. Like the person that was talking about killing himself completely disappeared. And he came back with the lyrics for People Are Strange, and he had the whole melody in his mind.
Wow.
So Jim Morrison was a classic romantic in the sense that he had really high highs in which he would create beautiful art. Like Van Gogh with painting the Starry Night. But after a year after painting the Starry Night, Van Gogh committed suicide. And he left on his suicide note, that misery goes on, it has no end. That's very similar to what Jim Morrison says in his poetry album, American Prayer, where he says, could any hell be more horrible than now and real? So this is someone who is a lot like the romantic set that Colin Wilson wrote about in The Outsider. And a song like People Are Strange is came out of like those highs and lows that he experienced. You know, it's a song that came out of a peak experience where, you know, he was just in this really dark place, and suddenly he's in this place that is just like the mountaintops. I think, you know, you could see. I don't want to psychoanalyze. That's why at the beginning of the book I talk about you know, John Mack saying that we don't want to psychoanalyze. We want to find out what their achievements are. But for people, we all have peak experiences. But peak experiences for secret teachers like Jim Morrison, like they're Himalayan peak experiences. Like they're huge. They have great artistic magnitude in their mind. Like you know, Jim Morrison heard music in the same way that Mozart heard music. You know, in that summer of 1965, he got songs marching into his head from his right brain that, you know, 5 or 6 of them became the greatest songs in all rock music. You know, Jim Morrison might not have like played an instrument, but he was every bit the musician. He heard music, and he was able to communicate, you know, what he heard to, you know, to Ray Manzarek, you know, the Doors members, who are great musicians, to be able to create what he heard in his mind. But yeah, that's the story with how People Are Strange came out. It's that story that made me realize that, you know, Jim Morrison was a classic romantic that way. And that fits in, you know, romanticism fits in with the whole Western esoteric tradition of people waking up to the spirit world, you know, that other reality, you know, the whole idea of the outsider, you know, all of those guys, you know, like William Blake. William Blake had visions almost daily. This is a person who was very much in contact with the spirit world. We have to remember, this is a band called The Doors. Okay, it's a book. It's a name they got from Aldous Huxley's book, The Doors of Perception. Aldous Huxley is the author of the Perennial Philosophy. This person is a secret teacher in their own right.
And he got it from William Blake. Yeah.
And you got it from William Blake. Exactly. So, you know, this you know, it's an amazing story. It has an amazing spiritual root to it.
Beautifully said, and thank you. I agree with you. As we get to the end, Paul, I guess I have one last question. What do you think of him not dying? As Hodges writes in his book, and I use Hopkins. I actually use Jerry Hopkins' bio of Elvis in my book, but there's nothing sensationalistic of all the. But what do you think? Do you think Jim survived, or do you think this was it? This is the end?
I'm inclined. So everything in Paris is very, very mysterious. So Jim Morrison moves to Paris in March 1971. He tells Bill Siddons, the manager, like, I don't know who I am anymore, and I need to just get back in touch with myself. You know, I guess how I was feeling when I got to L.A. from Boston. Right? He just wants to move to Paris and find poetry again and all that. Of course, there's the Miami thing hanging over his head, etc. And when he's in Paris, he's still drinking. In some of the cafes, they ask him to leave because he has these like huge drinking fits that are reminiscent of, like, you know, when Beau was a kid and he goes to Paris and, you know, he's running around, you know, with Paul Verlaine and they're making a scene. You know, Jim Morrison's having a scene as well. His asthma is coming back. He was an asthmatic and he's coughing up blood. That's what his friend Alan Rene noticed, and other of his friends. He takes a trip to Morocco with Pamela for a few days. They stop in Madrid. That's when he stands in front of Bosch's The Garden of Earthly Delights for 3 or 4 hours. You know, he wrote a paper about Bosch in FSU, saying that Bosch was an Adamite. The Adamites were 2nd and 3rd century Christians in North Africa who worshipped naked.
Yeah, and danced around. Yeah, they were wild.
So Jim Morrison was pretty thrilled when he could finally, like, you know, see this painting. And Pamela Curson had a heroin habit. She was hanging around with this French count named Jean de Breteuil. And she was around him in Paris, and Jean Breteuil's scene was all, you know, heroin dealers and everything like that. There is one story, it's a good documentary, you can find it on YouTube, where Jim Morrison used to hang out at the rock and roll circus in Paris. Mick Jagger could be seen there, etc. And there's a lady there named Nicole Gosselin who says that she saw Jim Morrison there that night, and then she saw him drunk around Jean de Breteuil and all these people who had heroin. And then they saw Jim Morrison being taken out of a bathroom. He looked dead, and they put him in a a car, and then he drove away. Now, they found Jim Morrison in a bathtub. Pamela found him that way. That's a common way to revive somebody who might be having an overdose from heroin. So, and there are people who left Paris after that because they were afraid that they might be connected to Jim Morrison's death, because some people testified that they told friends who they interviewed that they were afraid that the heroin that they gave to Jim Morrison that night at the club, that it might be found out to them. I think the more likely story with this is that, so he died on July 3rd, and then he was buried on July 7th. And there's only 5 people at the funeral. So if the authorities found out that Pamela Curson was into heroin, and they were able to, they did an autopsy on Jim Morrison and found heroin, because no autopsy was done. It was just determined by the coroner that he died of a heart attack. Then that means Pamela Curson would stand a good chance of being charged with contributing to Jim's death, murder or manslaughter or whatever. And I think that worried her. And it's hard to believe that friends are not telling Pamela Curson of what could happen if they find traces of heroin in Jim Morrison's body. So Pamela Curson told the authorities that she didn't know there was no next of kin with Jim Morrison. So that paved the way for a fast burial. In other words, let's just get him buried so I don't have to go to jail in case all of this blows up and I can get out of the country. I think that's, the more likely story. Did Jim Morrison disappear? John Densmore in an interview says it's possible. Jim Morrison had the money. You could back then. There's no cyberspace. There's no internet. There's nothing like that. I think that would be very hard for him to remain, invisible today. I think that'd be really difficult. I think it would also be pretty difficult to disappear back then as well. Jim Morrison made L.A. Woman just before leaving, which was like their big critically acclaimed album. You talked about Riders on the Storm and how much you loved it, how much your dad loved it. Paul Rothschild hated it. He's like, listen, you guys produced your own album. Like, I don't know what this is. I don't want to do anything like this. And when the last conversation that Jim Morrison had with any member of the Doors was with John Densmore, and they were talking on the phone, and Jim Morrison asked, like, how's the album doing? And John Densmore was like, the album's doing really well. And the fans love it, and the critics really like it too. So, Jim Morrison had thoughts like, maybe in the future at some point, we can all go back to making music again. Some people say that before Jim Morrison left for Paris, the Doors were over. And some people say that before Jim Morrison left, the Doors were not over. Nobody knows the truth about this at all. But it is clear that Jim Morrison was feeling like it's time to get out of the country. It's time to distance myself from things that are happening in the United States. And I think in Paris, he was also very worried about what would happen if he came back to America and he lost on appeal, because then he goes to Rayford prison for 6 months of hard labor. And Jim Morrison, out of anybody, knows what happens to people like him in society, that they're jailed, they're made into a pariah. Sometimes they're put to death. I think there's a lot of indication. We don't have hard evidence, but I think there's a lot of indication that they're trying to corner Jim in a prison where it would be easy to get him killed. When he went to Paris, he was living in Oscar Wilde's room where Oscar Wilde died while they were waiting to move into their apartment. And Oscar Wilde was the English writer who they put him in prison for 2 years in England, for moral turpitude. They like Socrates, they accused him of corrupting the youth of England. And then Oscar Wilde, just like Jim Morrison, he wanted to go to Paris to see if he could recover his health, and that didn't happen. He died. They buried him in Père Lachaise. And then 3 months later, Jim Morrison joins him in Père Lachaise as well.
Exactly.
Jim Morrison's life is absolutely amazing. It's incredible. Like, I really love all the stuff I discovered, and I feel really blessed that I can update Jim Morrison's legacy this way, so people can discover, his part about him. At the same time, it's a very sad, hard, and tragic story, because I discovered such an amazing person that has nothing to do with how he's portrayed in Oliver Stone's film. So, I hope from this, all of this changes, because, this guy at a very young age made millions of people happy with their art and their music and their person, and is still, doing this, like, 50 years later. The least we can do is to, to understand who he was through his lyrics and his poetry and his art. Like, I love knowing he gets out alive. I love all the rock and roll stories. It's all very intriguing and mysterious to talk about Paris and everything like that. But that's enough. We have to get to who he was and his art and his literature and everything like that. The movie to me is Oliver Stone living out his rock and roll dreams vicariously through Val Kilmer. That's what that movie is.
Yeah. Well, I was that way when I was young. I want to be like him. Party all night. Yeah, well said indeed, and thank you for that. But yeah, for sure, I know Jim is happy with what you've done, and I think you're going to move the needle, bring more awakening to a world that needs a lot of awakening. So, yeah, great book. I highly recommend it to the audience. Get it now; it will make a difference in your life. But yeah, we are at the end. Vance, thanks for keeping us company.
Oh yeah, Paul, I enjoyed you making Jim come alive for us on And Bite here. Really, I got a good sense of the deeper part of him that we didn't see on the surface.
Indeed, and Paul, yes, I have it on the show notes. People want to know more about you. PaulWyld.com is where they go.
Yes.
Okay. And of course, your book is found everywhere where books are found, right? Website,
favorite,
Traditions,
platform.
Amazon.
Yep. Barnes & Noble and Amazon and Books A Million. The audiobook just came out.
Oh, wow.
So it's available now as an audiobook.
Awesome. Can't wait to do it. Did you do it yourself or did you have somebody do it?
No, Simon & Schuster found a British person named Jez Sands to read the book, and he has a great voice, so I'm happy with that.
Oh, okay. I was thinking maybe you'd get a Jim Morrison impersonator or something.
Well, I didn't know that. I told myself, like, I have to make an audiobook. I guess I have to start, reciting my book. So I was very happy when I suddenly found it one day on the internet. It's like, great, I don't have to do this now.
Right,
yes, it's available as an audiobook.
It's a lot of work. I'm going to do the Elvis book myself. I don't know if when I quote Elvis, I'll do his accent, but yeah, it's a lot of work.
I think you have the perfect voice for your book on Elvis. I'm very much looking forward to reading that.
Awesome. Yes, certainly. Yes, it's all part of a good vibe and everything else. Well, Paul, for the audience, thanks for being here. I hope you enjoyed it. Please support Aeon Byte. Please get Paul's book and let's continue on this journey. Paul, thank you very much and loved your book and good luck with everything.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
Pleasure is all ours. And for everybody else, enjoy the rest of your Saturn day. And yes, next week we will be dealing with another rock star called Baphomet. So get ready because we've missed a lot about Baphomet. So let's deal with him.
He's a good horn player.
Yes,
that's hilarious.
Yes, I've heard. All right. Good night, everybody.